Welcome to a very special series on the St. Luke's podcast that is all about deconstructing faith. We're your hosts, Jon Jones and Mindie Moore, and we've been through the process of deconstructing and building back faith, and we love to talk about it with you. This is a 6-part series where we can go deeper into some of the elements that make deconstruction difficult, but also so very worth it. Whether you're at the beginning of your deconstruction journey or you've been doing this work for decades, we're glad you're here. Well, welcome everyone to Ep.3 in our series on deconstructing faith. Hi, Jon.
Hi, Mindie.
How are you today?
I'm good.
Good. Okay, there's some gardening happening outside. I'm just going to name it, my friends. If you hear a little yard work, the gardening is happening. That is just fine. We were wondering if the guy working outside was listening to the podcast while we're recording the podcast.
I would be.
I hope that's happening. But today, we're going to have a conversation about the relationship between church trauma and deconstruction. Now, when we were working on our content, I titled some of these episodes, and I titled this one, Church Trauma and Deconstruction, Name a More Iconic Duo.
But it's true on a lot of levels. So I don't think you were wrong on that.
I know. Thank you.
You're
Thank you for that. And I'm kidding, but I figure like if you don't laugh, you cry. It's kind of one of these situations
Fair
with
play.
church trauma. But in all seriousness, before we get into this, we do want to say something that this is an important topic. We know that church trauma is not a joke. And if you are someone who, this is the story that you're living right now, or maybe it's been your story in the past, we just want to say, like, as we have this conversation, that we see you, that there's space for you, and that we hope that you can find some healing through what we talk about today.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, if nothing else, that you know that like you're not alone in having this experience.
Yeah, definitely not alone in having that experience, because the numbers are pretty strong in terms of that, right?
Yes. I brought some statistics.
Well, look at you. All right. Let's see this thing.
Can I share them, please? All right.
Give me your best shot.
So I was doing some Googling and found some church trauma stats. And it's that 27 to 33% of U.S. adults report experiencing religious trauma.
Oof, man, that number is...
It's a high number.
That is way higher than I expected it to be.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe it's not actually way higher than I expected it to be. That might actually be kind of dead on the money.
Really? Okay. Yeah. And I think it is important to say with that stat, that is not just Christian tradition. Okay, so that kind of encompasses all faiths. We're only going to be talking about the
trauma.
church and Christian tradition in our conversation.
Yeah,
but
fair.
And what we know is that of those who have experienced religious trauma, it is always higher in marginalized groups.
Oh, I mean, certainly so, because, it's setting the boundaries and all of a sudden you get pushed to the edges and you're not inside the boundaries anymore. And so then that hurts.
Yeah. Yeah. Something that kind of blew my mind, again, it makes sense, but it's a big number, is that in the last 25 years, 40 million Americans have left their churches.
40 million. That is a very large number, and yet simultaneously, I would maybe argue not as surprising as, the number sounds.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you hear these stats, like what do you think about when you hear this, Jon? Like what comes to mind?
That we have a really, really messed up church, pretty heavy duty over the course of the years, and that is probably not the way that Jesus drew this whole thing up back in the day. What's kind of fascinating is that church trauma, is religious trauma, but religious trauma is not isolated to just our time period, I would argue. That religious trauma has been going on since biblical times, since Jesus, since, disciples were experiencing religious trauma and having people kind of kicking them out and being bummed at them. And so it's nothing that hasn't happened before in the human experience, but that doesn't make it any less painful just because it's been happening for a long time.
Yeah. And what I thought when I saw these stats, and I love how you just framed it, because the question that came up for me is, so then what is the future of the church? Because I think the thing that is new, even if like this trend, this topic isn't new, is that I think we're living in a time where people do not feel obligated to be attached to a church.
Yeah.
Like it's not like it used to be where like your social status is connected to it. Now,
It's your country club. Yeah.
right. And in some parts of our country, it's probably more true than others. I'll give that. And so if you're listening in certain parts of the U.S., you might be like, actually where I am, yes.
For sure.
But I do think like our collective attitude toward like obligatory church attendance is different.
Yeah, though, I would argue that that hasn't always been true everywhere because growing up on the West Coast, so, I grew up in California, Oregon, Washington. I grew up in a post-Christian culture where it was never assumed that I would go to church at any point in time. In fact, if anything, if you did go to church on the West Coast, you were like a freak and a geek, like the kind of person who like, why do you do this? And so if you do it, you're probably legitimately bought in on it kind of gig. And so when I moved to Texas for the first time, where
that was a culture shift,
still very alive and well in terms of church country club experiences, it was actually a bit of a shock to the system for me that it was assumed that everybody went to church. It wasn't like, do you go to church? Like, what church do you go to? And it's almost like a status kind of thing. And so I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a bad trend in some ways. There's parts of people leaving church that's okay in the sense that maybe they weren't bought in all the way. Maybe it was just a guilt factor. Maybe this was, more based on shame and on just kind of like collective family value kind of thing that they'd held rather than was any sort of personally held value. And in that case, I think it's totally fine to have walked away from it. But I do think there is a side, and maybe kind of what we're pointing toward today has more to do with the idea of not just leaving because you don't buy in necessarily, but leaving because the experience of your religious community was specifically traumatic to your experience and the ways that you were able to engage with the community.
Yeah. And I think we have to remember too, like when people experience trauma in church, it's not like what happens in church stays in church.
No.
It spills out into all these other different areas of your life and your personhood and your identity. And I think that's why it's such a tricky topic because it's not like, I'm trying to think of like a good sort of correlation. It's not like you I don't know, play a sport and you have a bad experience. You're like, okay, I played soccer and I didn't make a single goal all season and the teammates were really mean to me and I really hated that. So I'm just like done playing soccer. Cool, I'll go try something else.
Sure.
It's not that easy to walk away from church or to say like, hey, this place that was supposed to love me and nurture me and like teach me about God who created me, like it didn't work and it harmed me.
Yeah.
So what in the world am I left with?
Well, and you have a bunch of people there that ostensibly you have a great relationship with, that you love kind of gig. There are people, at least in almost every church trauma situation I've ever seen, there are still people there who you love, who were essential to your experience, and maybe they didn't experience trauma the same way you did. And so then when you try to explain your church trauma to them, they don't see it, hear it, feel it. They can't grasp it the same way you do, and it leaves you feeling like you're on an island, Mm-hmm.
And do you think like people get defensive when you try to bring that up?
Yeah, certainly so, because for better or for worse, part of the religious experience, especially I would argue maybe in American faith practice, is so much about being right, kind of constructing a wall of being right in your life. And that it's less about the idea of faith in terms of trust and more about the idea of certainty. And so when you're going to somebody and saying, hey, there might be some toxicity or there might be some brokenness inside of this religious system that you've bought into, the idea that there could be brokenness along with my certainty doesn't really sit well.
Yeah. And it's so I just had an experience recently where I got an invitation to a youth group reunion.
Wait, are you for real?
I'm very for real. I did. And the person who invited me is someone who I love dearly and had a huge role in shaping my faith experience. So like, love to her forever. And I saw this invitation and like my body like reacted.
Yeah.
And I thought, ooh, if I went to that, I don't think I would have a great time. And what I know is there's people who are going to that who will have the best time.
Yeah, sure.
Because
Yeah.
they had such a different experience in that setting. And it's so fascinating how like two different people who go to the same environment, who sit in the same small group, you know,
Sing
who have the same fog machine, all the things, you know, but they can have totally different experiences in that community.
Yeah, very much so.
And I think that's hard to hold relationally, because it's like, I'm not trying to say to you, like, you're wrong. Your experience was wrong.
Right.
But I do want you to hear my experience.
Yeah. And I think that's the difficulty, right? And I think you see it a lot in people who are deconstructing, or if you follow online accounts for deconstruction and church trauma and that kind of stuff, is that if it feels like you haven't been believed inside of your trauma, or if it feels like you haven't been acknowledged or that you haven't been seen inside of it, sometimes we try to become louder so that way more people will agree and I'll feel validated inside of it. And yet the reality, like you're saying, is that not everybody experiences and feels that same level of trauma. That for some people, they felt like this was the best moments of their life, you know? Mm-hmm. And that's tough. But, you know, I want to go back a little bit to something you said in there, is that where you talked about feeling it in your body, because I think there's something to that I won't speak for you, but for myself, when I was in church situations where it felt like I was being judged, or it felt like I was towing the line, or it felt like I was like on the edge of heresy in their minds, not in my mind, but in their minds, I remember feeling my body tensing up in those moments of walking into the church. I remember sitting in worship and both wanting to be a part of it because I believed so heavily in this God, and I wanted so badly to feel something spiritual inside of me. And simultaneously, as soon as, you know, the pastor got up and started talking or doing something like that, or we're supposed to shake hands with people, and you see that one person walking across to shake hands with you, and you're like, oh boy, please don't shake my hand.
Go to that person.
Yeah, go over there, not to me. But I think there's something to that.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's like, it's hard to sort of like sit with that and ask questions about that and interrogate it. But I think we need to.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Because it's, I think sometimes we think like, okay, I feel this way in my body in this space, but I should just push through it.
Yeah.
I should just like find a way to be okay.
Yeah.
And especially when we're talking about something like trauma and faith spaces, I actually think maybe our job is not to push through, but it's to pay attention.
Yeah.
And it's to honor whatever God is trying to tell us through our bodies and through how we're feeling.
Well, that's a little bit like, I don't know what kind of sports background you have, but
very little, John. Very little athletic background.
I love when I choose an analogy that just absolutely has nothing to do. I
played a season of basketball in elementary school, and I made 0 baskets the entire season.
So this is totally going to fall flat with you, but somebody out there is totally going to get this.
There is an athlete among us.
Yeah, is that when you are playing a sport and you're out on the field and the adrenaline's coursing, sometimes you don't notice when an injury happens. Like if you just have a little muscle strain, or if you tweak your knee a little or your ankle, when I was playing soccer, for instance, like, you know, you'd be running on these like super muddy fields and like kind of step weird. And you could tell that didn't feel comfortable, but the adrenaline's coursing so heavy that you just don't notice it. And I think in church, it's that way sometimes, where it's almost spiritual adrenaline, that in the moment, you are so caught up in feeling spiritual and almost spiritual romanticism, right? This idea that it's like, oh, it's just so wonderful to be a part of this experience. And then you get past it and you go home and you're like, I felt good there, but now I don't feel so good being here. And it feels like something in my body is off. And I think it's that same kind of thing, is that how do we pay attention to what we feel in ways that help us to understand how we're processing, not just in the moment, but throughout the totality of our life.
Yeah. So, you know, if we frame this conversation in the terms of deconstruction, like how do we think that church trauma and deconstruction intersect? Because it's not like well, I guess I should back up. You know, we can be in a church setting and not be deconstructing and experience church trauma.
Yeah, certainly.
Like that can happen. I mean,
100%.
There are leaders who are abusive. There are horrible things that happen. And so, you know, sometimes those things, they happen against anything that we are even involved in.
Yeah.
And for our conversation today, I think that like often the two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I don't think they absolutely have to be tied together all the time. I think you could deconstruct without having church trauma, and I think you can have church trauma without having to choose to deconstruct. But I do think that the normative experience for most people in the middle of deconstruction or making the steps toward deconstruction is to have experienced church trauma. And I think largely because you have experienced things in life, or you've learned and grown in fresh ways in your life, and you end up hearing something and it doesn't match your experience, or you have an interaction with somebody at church, and that interaction doesn't match what you've been told your entire lifetime. And you sit there saying, hey, whether it's, I won't jump into the politics of anything, but whether it's you see people who you love dearly who have taught you certain ways, and you're like, hey, I'm pretty sure that's not the way of Jesus, but you can vote that way, I guess, if you want. But that doesn't feel good to me inside. And there's a trauma attached to that of saying, well, is everything I learned invalid now? If this isn't true about the people who taught me and led me, is the entire thing messed up and broken, or is there some sort of redeeming value inside of this? And is this more like a knee and ankle injury than it is like lopping off your leg?
Yeah. And I think it gets so tricky because so often when we're in the church, like the relationships that we hold, in some ways, I think we can equate those to our relationship with God.
Oh, 100%, yes.
So like I knew someone in college who a leader from their home church had like a huge moral failing. And it was tragic and terrible and like things that you never want to see happen in a church.
Yeah.
And then to add on to the tragic, the terrible, this person was like, well, this was the one who taught me like everything I know about God.
Right.
And so like, if they could do this, then I think the whole thing is just, it's suspect. It's broken. It doesn't work. And so I'm just done.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard stories like that so often.
Yeah.
And I guess this is just my like plug for the leaders listening because I feel so passionately about this. Like if you're leading in a church space, like I know we love the word integrity. That's everyone's gonna be like, ooh, the ratings just went up. She said integrity. It's great. But like it matters.
It really does.
It matters that like your character is
in sync.
Is healthy. Yeah. Because I think so many people, that's where the trauma stems from. They see a leader fail or fall or like just have something happen. And it's like, it throws everything into question.
Yeah. Well, you question, is it safe, right?
Yeah.
Is church safe? Are leaders even safe? And, I had one of those experiences in the first church that I worked at where I was hired on. I'm a youth pastor at this point, and the senior leader at the church was embezzling money and using it to buy a vacation home down in the Bahamas. And he had pulled the numbers out of the bulletin and, all this kind of stuff. Wow. And in order to cover it up, decided that he would just get rid of a couple people real quick so he could make up that shortfall by the end of the year. And he was in cahoots with kind of the head of the elder board there. And so one of the people that he decided to get rid of was me. But to do that, he created lies about me that weren't true. And the congregation rallied around me, which was awesome because, like you said, my character had been enough in sync with who I was that they knew it wasn't true. But there was something to it where all of a sudden it's like, is this safe at all? And God, if I'm going to be serving inside of a church or attending a church or volunteering, if I'm going to be doing anything with the church, I don't know if I can trust it anymore because this is not what I signed up for at all. And it was a very physical level of trauma mixed together with intellectual and social trauma because when I left that church, they literally just shut the door and I was done. Like I was not a part of this fellowship anymore. I wasn't going to be able to see my friends. I wasn't going to be able to do this. It was like being cut out of a family all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And there's something so ridiculously painful with that, which is why I think for so many people who have experienced church trauma, maybe it's not on the level of having been directly in the firing line of a embezzling pastor or something like that. But that doesn't make their church traumas any less, is what I would say, is that the pain from it still hurts, even if it was just, a youth pastor who looked at you and said, you can't ask that question here because it's heretical.
Yeah. And I wonder if that is like what you're getting to with the relationships. Like it felt like losing a family,
Yeah.
the doors were just
Felt
shut.
like a divorce.
And I wonder if that is why people stay.
Yeah.
Maybe I would say too
Too long. Yep.
Yeah, in church
Yep.
situations
Yep.
that are really not healthy, because it's like, but those are my people. Those
Yeah.
are the ones that like visited me when I had the baby and knew when my mom was sick, and they did all the things, but now it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do?
Well, it's hard because in those moments, then it almost creates a heavier level of dissonance inside of your soul, where if I'm willing to go against what I know to be true or what I feel inside of myself, am I doing a disservice to me? Am I lying to my own self in these moments? And it's only when that cognitive dissonance reaches such a level that I'm willing to act on it, that finally we can break those traumas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do we think, like, for people who are experiencing this now, or maybe, they have experienced it, what's our advice for people? I'm going to say therapy.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I love therapy.
That's where I was going to go, number
Yes.
one. In the church world, having a therapist has not always been looked on well. When
I think that's why I want to start with it, because it's like I want to take away that stigma, and it 100%. Is a good thing.
Yeah, 100%. I would say that find yourself a therapist, especially if you can find somebody who specializes in religious trauma, is really helpful. Somebody to talk to and to help. Deconstruction is really just deconstructing the pieces that have built into you, and somebody who can see those pieces and help you to remove them in a safe way without feeling like you're having to just throw out your entire life, I think is really important. I would also add on to there, not to be afraid of medication in that, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds. Again, something that hasn't been looked on too favorably a lot of times inside of the church world. And it took me until I was like basically 40 before I started on any of it. And it changed my life.
Yeah.
And I just think we have to be willing to use the tools that are available in order to begin to heal well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like even investing like the time,
Yeah.
To know that the hurt that you experienced in the church is not just something you have to like get over. I mean, I guess it's the same thing as like when you're paying attention to your body. You don't just have to push through. You don't just have to get over this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little bit like if you, like break a leg or, rip a tendon or something like that. You wouldn't just put the cast on, take the cast off, and then go running again the next day. You would go spend time in rehab, and that rehab would start small, moving the leg like this, and you get more mobility as time goes on. And so I do think there is a sense where it's okay to take time away from the church world if that's what's necessary for you. I do think it's okay too, just to let go of some of the unhealthy relationships that have not been there for you. But I would also say too, I think in the middle of that is be willing to see too where the healthy bits and pieces have been.
Yeah.
That not everything you experience, one horrific trauma does not mean the entire package is broken necessarily. Yeah. And that's not a plea for you then to jump back in at all. That's not a plea for you to say, hey, just stick it out and just, shoulder your way through it or go back to the place that was most traumatic for you by any stretch of the imagination. I think you should avoid all of that. But I do think investigating inside of your own soul and figuring out what are the things that actually did make me who I am, that are healthy. What are the things that brought joy? What are the things that caused peace? Where are the places where I grew to be more human than I was before? And not throwing those out, because those are core components of who you are a little bit. And it's okay to heal the one part of you that's really broken while simultaneously continuing to grow in the health of the other pieces.
And what I like about that thought is that, I think a lot of times when we see people deconstruct, there is so much, I guess, like bitterness that kind of comes through. And look, we have pain, we have like that's all real. Yeah. And I think sometimes that comes from thinking like, well, this door is just shut forever. Like it's nailed shut, it's locked. I can never go back into a faith community.
Yeah.
And you may not be able to go back into a faith community for a while, but I would say like, if you feel sort of that pull or that desire to let yourself explore that, and to, you can visit a church and not like give them your info.
Oh,
that was controversial.
Oh, I love it.
It was. But you could just like go and kind of lurk and then leave and just see how it felt.
Yeah, for sure you can.
And that is okay. And so I guess I want to encourage people that, you're allowed to kind of have those seasons where maybe this isn't a safe place, but if it's something you're missing and you're longing for, just see what that's about.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very normal to still believe in God, to still value God, to still want to follow God, and yet not to trust those who are his followers sometimes.
Yep. Yeah.
That is a normal thing. And, if you're somebody who is walking with someone in those spaces, if you're somebody who, I'm not in the middle of church trauma, but you have a friend or a spouse or a child that's walking through that, I think have enough grace and enough mercy on them to not have to say stuff like, well, it's not all churches are that way or something like, because I've had people tell me that and it's like, come on, man. Like, I get it. Not all places are totally broken, but this is what I've experienced and been through, and be willing to walk through it with them and to help carry that trauma for them a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess that's a great place to kind of wind down on, if you are experiencing church trauma, or maybe you have someone in your life who is, I think that idea of like, we can carry this together is so huge.
Yeah.
Because it can feel so isolating.
Yeah.
And it can feel like, I don't know, like we're just the only ones, or maybe there's something wrong with me. And so I think there is such a gift in saying like, I hold this with other people.
Well, it's the way of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Is that if you look at it with him and his disciples, and they're coming out of religious trauma, whether you have like Simon the Zealot, who's, all but like a terrorist at that point in time, training to attack. If you've got somebody like, Matthew, who's carrying trauma of having served the wrong people and kicked out of the religious establishment. If you're, the fishermen who, basically weren't good enough to make it in religious school. And here's Jesus healing them and bringing them alongside of him and redefining faith right in front of their eyes. And so the cool part, if you're facing religious trauma, is that it's very possible that God could use other people, other human beings who are actually in healthy, holistic spaces to help heal you, to help redefine what faith and spirituality could be for you. And so you don't have to fear other human beings. You can actually just walk with them and in the course of time, find yourself in a fresh place.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's our hope today, is that you could sense someone walking with you on your journey. And, if this is something that you are really in the middle of, like we said, I hope that you have those people. I hope you, aren't afraid to reach out to professionals for guidance and health and healing. And, we hope that as we keep going on in this series, that we can be that space.
Yeah.
So we're glad that you all joined us today as we talked about deconstruction and church hurt. Name a more iconic duo.
I love it.